Alrighty, I am here with Ben Zeisloft. We're going to be talking about his new book called Forsakes of the Fatherless, The Secret Treachery of the Pro-Life Establishment. The book is about what the title says it's about, but it's actually pretty terrible what's in the book. It's one of these books, usually I'm reading theology books or whatever, and I'm very interested in it. There's a couple books that I've read like this one. There's another one that I read a while back called The Story of Abortion in America, where it just street level view of abortion from the I think it was like from the 1750s to the 2020s. And some of these books are hard to read because you're especially about abortion. It's so evil. It's so messed up. And then you see all the manipulation and all the lies and you're just like, this is horrible. So, this book is even more terrible because you're looking into the pro-life movement and whether or not it's actually pro-life. You'd think a pro-life movement would be pro-life because of the name and what they claim to stand for. But before we get into all the details of the book, I guess I want to know two things. One, why did you think I want to write this book? I want to talk about this particular topic. And two, in the book, you make a distinction, kind of a distinction between pro-life and abolitionist. And so can you kind of go into both of those things and we can go further?
Yeah, certainly. So I've been reporting for the past 4 or 5 years on the abortion issue in America, starting at Daily Wire, through the Republic Sentinel, and for a couple other news outlets, actually. So been noticing that trend of sound Christians in their state legislatures proposing bills to abolish abortion. And then their enemies are, the pro-life establishment groups. It's usually not Planned Parenthood, pro-choice groups, and especially in red states, it's often these established pro-life groups that are the main enemies of abolition. So It's shocking because these groups go into churches and they fundraise from Christians and, pro-life grandmas who are cutting part of their Social Security check to give these groups really, self-sacrificially trying to end abortion in America. And these groups are not doing what they're implying that they're doing, which is, they say they're trying to end abortion. They're trying to, make it unthinkable or one of these things. And really, they're doing the opposite. They're defeating efforts that would truly establish equal protection laws for preborn babies, which gets into that distinction between abolition and pro-life. So an abolition group would say, let's not regulate abortion. Let's just call abortion what it is, which is murder. And let's, apply the same exact homicide, wrongful death, assault laws that protect born people to also protect preborn people in the womb. So just basically removing the existing distinctions in the law that treat them as two distinct separate classes of people, which we know as Christians, they're not, right? In terms of innate value, they're exactly the same. It's just the size, the location, things of that nature. So our laws, don't distinguish with that with any other type of person. There's no law that says, murdering a toddler is less severe than murdering a 30-year-old just because of the size, right? Or level of development. So it defies logic, defies the scriptures, defies common sense to say that there should be any distinction in terms of taking the life of somebody who's born versus not born. So the abolitionist movement is trying to recognize that, whereas the pro-life groups often aren't.
So I guess the abolitionists seem to be just explicitly Christian, whereas the pro-lifers, what it seems like is that they sometimes will pretend to be Christian, sometimes what we'll say, we're not Christian, we're just making an appeal to natural law or something like that. I guess my question is, like, some of these pro-life movements, as far as I know, I'm only 20, what am I, 25? I just turned 26. So I'm 26. What I understood was that a lot of these pro-life movements started with Christian rhetoric saying we want to get rid of abortion altogether a long, long time. I mean, we're talking in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, because that was when Roe was passed and all that stuff. And so is that correct? Did a lot of these pro-life movements start with good intentions, or did they start as abolitionist or and then morph into something new, or were they always just sort of mealy-mouthed liars?
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of them were founded by sincere people, Christians, Roman Catholics, who would say, it sort of depends. So the 1970s were sort of the era of, not relative truth, but not being as explicitly Christian as we are today, I suppose. Right. We didn't have the moral majority yet in some of those developments that said, no, we should do this on the basis of God's word because we're a Christian nation and so forth. So a lot of these groups would have said, and they still say today in a lot of cases, we're non-sectarian. A lot of us are Christians, are Roman Catholics, are religious people, but we don't argue from that basis. We argue from science, from philosophy. So you sort of see the worldview issues that I think we've learned the hard way in the Western world for the past 40, 50 years. And there's still that inertia of having outdated views on the states, on whether or not we have a neutral state, right? We now learned the hard way again that there's no neutrality with the government, that we're going to have either Christ as Lord, or demonic statues in our state capitals, or pride flags hanging outside the White House. Right. So we've learned the hard way that we actually have to be assertive as Christians and stand on the Word of God, and also science and logic and all the rest. But really, our ultimate foundation is, God is the creator of all things. He's the creator of babies in the womb. We have to obey him. We're all going to, stand before him in judgment. So are our lawmakers, especially. They're his servants of justice. So if you don't have that as a foundation, you're not going to get very far. And I think that's why we haven't gotten very far on this issue in 50 or 60 years. What's
the argument from these? I mean, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. So most of the churches have pride flags in Madison, Wisconsin. The ones that don't have pride flags basically agree with all the liberal worldview and ideology. So, I'm hearing a lot of stuff still, sort of the old rhetoric of separation between church and state and things like that. There's always this idea that the church should kind of just be over here and should say, like, we don't like abortion, but we should never, ever, ever, ever try to get involved in government ever, and never try to defy the government, because that would just, I don't know why, but I guess my question for you is, like, what's the arguments that you're hearing on the, let's just say, I don't know, is that the pro-life side that's just sort of like, we don't want to be really involved in the government side of this thing. We're just going to kind of say we think abortion is bad, or what's the argument from the pro-lifers per se, in their philosophical or theological argument? Do they have one?
Sure. Yeah. Again, a lot of them just aren't working from Christian presuppositions about how government is supposed to work. So they're not looking at Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, seeing that the government is supposed to bear a sword against evildoers. So across the country, especially in Republican states right now, a big push is funding pregnancy centers, right? Giving money to pro-life pregnancy centers. Sure. And we know that's a good thing, but it's actually not going to end abortion. Because that's not really the reason why people murder others, is because there's a financial need, and that's what leads them to killing their babies. It's really convenience, prosperity, selfishness, all the rest. So and there's also rhetoric that sort of betrays that same lack of a foundation. So saying things like, let's make abortion unthinkable, right? And they do that by claiming that we should just impact the culture and do these sorts of vague things, rather than just passing laws that say, murdering anyone should be illegal for everyone. Just because somebody's in the womb doesn't mean they should be murdered under cover of law. Just because somebody's a woman doesn't mean that she has the right to commit murder of her preborn baby. And again, like, it's because they're not looking at this consistently. They're saying one thing, saying that abortion is murder, saying we should end abortion. But when it comes to brass tacks, when it comes to tactics, they're not serious, but actually advancing and codifying those views. Yeah.
Well, I wonder if those same people would be interested in making rape legal and then saying, let's make rape unthinkable. I don't think that they would agree with that. I don't think they would agree with that, or with making murder legal and just saying, I mean, obviously abortion is murder, but there's a lot of logical fallacies, a lot of breakdown in the logic, it seems like. Now, in your book, you kind of go through a multitude of different states. You start with Oklahoma, you talk about Arizona, Texas, North Carolina, and down the list, and just discuss sort of what the abolitionist movement has looked like in those states, and then how the pro-life movement has basically worked to kind of just shut down the abolitionist movement. I mean, we don't have to go through every state, but let's start in Oklahoma. I mean, what exactly has been happening in relationship to the abolitionist movement in Oklahoma?
Sure. In a lot of ways, that was ground zero for the abolitionist movement. So you had T. Russell Hunter, who's the main subject of my first chapter in the book, who was studying for a history of science degree and learning about 19th century ideology and therefore the abolitionist movement of slavery. And he was seeing how the main contrast between that issue was sort of like today, you had the anti-slavery gradualists who wanted to end slavery, incrementally, kind of chip away at it over time, over the course of decades. And then you had the abolitionists who said, no, let's actually try to abolish slavery. You had folks like William Wilberforce who proposed bills that would just end the slave trade instead of, regulating the slave trade. So other bills at the time were, trying to reduce the number of slaves you could put on a ship from 400 to 300, right? Really absurd things like that. So in noticing some of those things, a lot of Christians in Oklahoma applied that to the state law, the state capital, the whole system of laws in Oklahoma. Yeah. And again, they learned that, of course, just like 150 years ago, they were opposed by the anti-slavery gradualists, or in this case, the anti-abortion gradualists. the sort of controlled opposition. And that's what got a lot of attention from around the country. Other Christians trying to do similar things in states like Texas, Arizona, looking at Oklahoma and seeing that, no, it's going to probably be the pro-lifers who oppose us. And sure enough, that's what ended up happening across the country.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even as we're talking about it, I'm thinking about one of the things that everybody's noticed over the past 10 years with the rise of Trump, who has done a lot of good stuff. And he's done a lot of good stuff. But one of the things that has happened is that this big tent republicanism has made abortion or the abolitionist movement or just getting rid of abortion, even the pro-life movement, kind of just move to the side. I mean, am I wrong about, I can't remember correctly, the RNC, the convention, did they have a pro-life speaker? I can't remember. Maybe you do.
Well, the major thing that happened to RNC this year was they actually removed pretty much all of the pro-life distinctives in the Republican platform. So if you went back to 2016 and looked at, what the RNC platform says about life, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be several pages of, here's all the things we want to do. We want to, eventually end abortion in America. It says something like that. Here's all the detailed policies we want to use to actually get there. And then now it just says, we stand for life. We oppose late-term abortion, I think it says. And that unfortunately was the influence of Trump in his campaign. And a lot of the folks he let into his campaign who kind of made this pragmatic change between, in order to win a national election as a Republican, you can't run on abortion is kind of what they said. And it worked objectively, but the fruit of that, we're probably on the course of like a UK or Canada or another Western country. Yeah. That made that same trade, decades ago. And now both major parties are pro-abortion. That's probably where we're headed, unfortunately, as the United States.
Both pro-abortion and the birth rate is incredibly low. It just came out. What was this? Last month was the lowest in United States history, 1.6 children per woman in America, which is you can't survive as a civilization like that.
Right.
And so I guess my question would just then be, you mentioned the word like pragmatic or pragmatism. Is that the reasoning behind a lot of this movement away from the pro-life, did the Republicans just say this is just kind of a losing thing? People really don't care about this. So we don't really want that in our platform anymore. And they're just focused on winning and sort of utilitarian, whatever works will do. Is that what happened?
Yeah, unfortunately. So if you look at a lot of polls on how Republican voters cast their ballots, they'll mention immigration, economy, other very valid things first, but abortion will be like 9th or 20th on those lists. So just it's an indictment on the church too, right? Yeah. A lot of those people are going to be professing Christians, evangelicals, who would say, I oppose abortion, but they don't put the sort of moral weight or the attention they should on that issue of the murder of preborn babies in our midst, in our cities, in our states, in our country. So that's definitely a big reality. There is that subset of evangelical voters, even Roman Catholic voters who will show up to the polls just to oppose abortion. And it's a decent share. It's probably 10, 20% from what I've seen. So Trump kind of made that trade, right? Of do I turn these people off and decrease their propensity to vote in order to get more moderates, or do I not? And he went with the former, and it seems to have paid off. He won, all 7 swing states, but that really shows where we are as a country on that issue.
Yeah, it was also a little bit strange because he won those swing states, but I even think in Wisconsin here, you had Hovde go up against, I can't remember the senator. She's been here for a million years, whatever. It doesn't matter. She's a Democrat. I don't really care. But he was pro-life and he lost by like a couple, like maybe even 0.5%. Or I worked for this Dr. Scott Jensen campaign back when he ran in 2022 in Minnesota. And of course, Minnesota is incredibly progressive. And Scott basically what lost us the election was the fact that he was pro-life, and he was sort of like, this is wrong. We shouldn't kill babies. And the exit polls, I think, showed that a lot of these suburban women voted on the basis of we want to murder. We want it so that women can murder their babies. What has grasped our culture? I guess my question, like, what has grasped all of these women to make them, like, really, in certain ways, be single issue voters for abortion, for murdering babies?
Yeah, certainly. We're reaping the whirlwind from the sexual revolution. We're a few generations into it. It started with, women voting, moving away from the household and toward careers, things of that nature. And now, it's the point where I saw another stat today that, the majority of women by the time they're 45 will be single and childless, which is devastating.
I saw that.
If you look at the Bible and what God commends for women and says, this is the telos of woman, it's not, working in a cubicle. It's being with a husband and children and, being fruitful and multiplying, and, gets right into the birth rate issue too of 1.6 children per woman. You can't actually continue civilization that way. So there's this ideology that's unfortunately really gripped women, especially in the United States and the broader Western world of feminism and, sort of jettisoning those traditional values and seeing them as inferior. A big part of that is media too. And just a cultural mindset that says that a stay-at-home mom is not doing very much with her life. Whereas, as Christians, we would say, no, she's doing the best thing she possibly could be. But abortion is just a natural fruit of that. That's why a lot of women unfortunately get so, devoted to that, is because that's the ticket to staying in the workforce, to having that autonomy over yourself, is if you can kill your children. Same thing with birth control and some of those issues where you see a lot of emotion around them. It's because, that's the ticket to what they've been told, unfortunately, is autonomy, freedom, meaning. So they see any attempt to challenge those as inherently opposing them and their best lives and things of that nature.
I mean, how could having a baby be better than being like a mid-level manager at like a financial firm that nobody's ever heard of, right? That's the logic, and it doesn't really make any sense. Obviously, they've been brainwashed into this in the public school systems, especially, which is very sad. But so you are obviously talking about, we're talking about the Republican Party and things like that, but does it basically all boil down to people in the Republican Party, people in the so-called conservative media and some of these pro-life groups? Does it just come down to like, people aren't going to like me if I go against the grain and just say that we need to full ban abortion? Is that like, if you had to just say, here's one sentence of what it comes down to, it's just people don't like me. Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'd say I boiled it down to think about two, which is power and pride. So power is kind of what we're talking about, where, in order to win elections, in order to remain in the good graces of Republican leadership in a certain state, you can't push for things like abolishing abortion. That's too controversial. It might lose some seats in the next midterm elections, things of that nature. So instead, a lot of these groups fall into the temptation of serving as patsy organizations for the Republican leaders, the committee chairs, the majority leader, the speaker, sending out mailers and say this is a 100% pro-life Republican, even though, they killed the last abolition bill in their state, and really deceiving voters in saying that these people are actually, fighting hard to end abortion when they're doing the opposite. They're doing the bare minimum they possibly can, and they're much more preferring, symbolic victories that look really good on paper. But if you actually if you really think about it, if you read the bills themselves, they don't really do anything to end abortion. So that's the power element of falling into that temptation of, being in the room where it happens, having access, those sorts of things. And the pride too. So a lot of these, adversarial pro-life establishment lobbyists have been doing it for 40 or 50 years, and they've been going about the same incremental, let's regulate abortion out of existence sort of course. And so when somebody comes along and says, why don't we just try to end abortion? That's going to challenge them a little bit, because, they've spent their entire career going about it a certain way that has proven not to work. And it's a big ask sometimes to have the humility to say, what I didn't really work. I should acknowledge that and get on board with these efforts. And some have done that, to be clear, but a lot really haven't. So that's a good example of things like the second victim narrative, insisting that all women are victims of abortion. Maybe that was true if 40 or 50 years ago, where there was a lot more cultural shame around abortion, where women really knew that it was wrong and really wrestled with it morally. But now today you have Shout Your Abortion. You have a lot of pride, like we were just talking about, surrounding the fact that I have the legal autonomy to kill my baby in the womb, and nobody's going to stop me. It's that sort of defiant attitude. And a lot of the folks who've been around for a long time are sort of stuck in, a couple of generations past, those sorts of mindsets that prevail with abortion. And I think I'm your age too, so I'm about to turn 26 in a few months.
There you go. Nice.
Our generation, women our generation know exactly what they're doing, and they're more and more proud to say that. And we haven't adjusted for that. So if you had to boil it down, I think those are probably the two reasons: is pride and power, which are pretty dangerous when it comes to an issue as important as this.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I talk to somebody who's pro-abortion, the conversation oftentimes comes down to, okay, you want to get rid of abortion completely. What does that actually practically look like? Does that mean that women go to prison for murder, or does that mean that the abortionists go to prison and the women are sort of looked at as victims in the situation? What's the official abolitionist position on women who have abortions? Like, what's the desired outcome for those women?
Right. So equal protection bills, all they do is they apply the existing law to preborn babies. So whatever a woman or anybody else who participates in an abortion, whatever they do, or whatever charges they would have faced for killing a 1-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 30-year-old, they would face for killing a 1-month-old in the womb or a 6-month-old in the womb. So for murder, assault, wrongful death, so wrongful death is a civil category. Murder and assault are, of course, criminal. It would just be the exact same protections exist to save the lives of those babies as those who are outside the womb. So a lot of these abolition bills aren't really writing new law. They're actually just removing sections of old law that are in the homicide codes, and they just say none of this applies to abortion. So all you have to do is remove that, which is shocking that's even in there, right?
Right.
Yeah, you have to. If you remove that, you pretty much are done. You have now equal protection. So they're not trying to prescribe. Every single woman who ever has an abortion has to face the electric chair.
Why would they have ever put those little asterisks in the murder, the legal language of murder if abortion isn't murder? Why would they do that? Right.
It's shocking that it's even in there. And again, it's not just blue states that do that. I'm thinking of Texas has that sort of thing in their laws. It's because even the most pro-life among us have not actually acted consistently with treating it like murder. So we have these sorts of things that have developed in our laws. I don't know the exact backstory and how, who proposed those bills. It's actually a good thing to look into, but in any case, we're not trying to prescribe penalties for, certain cases. We're just saying apply the exact same standards that are already used. So that includes things like due process, probable cause, judges, juries, those sorts of things, to actually, surmise who's a victim and who's a guilty party, and are there degrees of guilt? Should we offer leniency in some cases? Did a woman face, significant pressure into having an abortion, or was she, this is her 8th abortion and she's brazen about it? Those sorts of questions can and should be asked and are currently asked under our current system of law, and we're just saying do that for preborn babies too. Treat them like people as well.
How effective has the abolitionist movement been across the country and I guess putting things into place, things that you're talking about, maybe getting rid of some of those asterisks? Like what's been the actual result of the abolitionist movement? Because I'm not hearing anything about them up here in Wisconsin, but we've got a lot of other problems to deal with before we probably get to that point. How's it looking maybe more down south?
Yeah. So to be clear, no abolition bill has ever passed. And it's often because of these pro-life groups. But what we're doing is we're very quickly shifting the conversation, and we're winning, a lot of people over just in the broader culture, but also especially in the state houses. So I remember 4 or 5 years ago when I started reporting on abolition for Daily Wire, when I would write about a bill, it'd be 1 or 2 really solid lawmakers who would propose it and were the bill sponsor and were championing it, and it would get nowhere, right? It would, kind of die in committee and nobody would ever hear of it again. And now we're getting to the point where, you have 20 plus members of the Republican caucus in a state house or a state senate that are endorsing these bills. So there's clearly a lot of buy-in. They're recognizing that it's necessary, that after Roe, abortion has not ended in their states. It's actually in many cases increased in red states. So the moral urgency is higher because of that. So we have, I think, over 15 or 16 bills across the country this year for abolition in 15 or 16 states, including a lot of states that have never had one. So Ohio, Michigan, which are sort of in your neck of the woods in the Midwest. So people recognizing that, equal protection is the only logical solution for what to do with abortion. It's a pretty incontrovertible position, especially if you're a Christian, right? If we're saying that these are image bearers of God, they're the same in value as everybody else, why not apply the same laws to protect them? So just speaking about that out loud in the culture, in the media, has shifted the conversation, has forced big pro-life groups to, be less aggressive in opposing our bills. That was the first time we saw that this year, was in a few states where in the past, pro-life groups would come out and testify against the bills. They were just nowhere to be found because they're scared of the bad press of having the reputation of that pro-life group that kills, good bills to end abortion. So we're starting to gain some ground. It's not overnight. It wasn't overnight for Wilberforce. It took them 20 years to actually the end of the slave trade. But so we're not deluded into thinking that this is going to be a quick fix. We're talking about legalized ritual child sacrifice in a increasingly pagan apostate culture. It's going to be an uphill battle, but we're trusting the Lord to bring about the results.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, Wilberforce is one of the there's two guys actually, both from England, that I look to as sort of, I guess, inspiration for this sort of thing. Obviously, Wilberforce is one of them, but Charles Spurgeon was incredibly outspoken against slavery, and he went as far as to say about the United States. He went as far to say maybe we need a civil war in the United States to end slavery in the United States. He wasn't afraid to just put himself out there in the political sort of way. He wouldn't take communion with a slave owner. Like, what are the pastors doing around the country? I don't know how much you know about this, but like, what are you seeing? What are you hearing about what pastors are saying in relationship to abortion? Because I haven't heard a pastor preach on abortion in my area my entire life. So are you seeing any positive movement there, or what's happening in the church?
Sure. Yeah. Same thing with the pro-life establishment. There's just a lot of inertia to overcome in the church. There's a lot of pietism, right? Where like we're talking about separation of church and state, and that has a real meaning, but they're perverting it to mean that the church can't speak on moral public issues like abortion, like homosexuality.
It kind of has a real meaning. Kind of. I mean, the idea of the separation of church and state, it came from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to, I think Adams. I can't remember. It was a letter from Thomas Jefferson to one of the founding fathers, where he mentions the idea of the separation of church and state. It wasn't really anything that was like established in law or anything like that. So it's like sort of a very abstracted idea that never really made itself into law, but it was taken by the left as this sort of beacon of like, no, see, look, Thomas Jefferson said separation of church and state, who, of course, he would be the one to say that because he was barely a deist rationalist, non-Christian. So anyways, sorry, not to cut you off, but you can go ahead. Yeah,
no,
go ahead.
That's right. Yeah. So his letter, I think it was to the Danbury Baptist. He mentioned the phrase, the wall of separation. So he wasn't saying that, we now have this secularized atheistic state. He was saying that, we don't have a certain denomination or, a national established religion. At the time he was writing that, 9 of the 13 colonies had established Christian denominations as their state churches. And, he didn't prefer that for Virginia, but most of the people just recognize that's part of our national framework, because we're a Christian nation and states have the right to do that. We just shouldn't have it federally. So that's really what separation of church and state gets down to. And as Protestants, we recognize the state and church have separate mandates both under God. So the church is word and sacraments. The state is civil justice, and they don't borrow those duties from one another. They stay in their lanes, but they work together. And they're both under the authority of Christ as king. But so that's the sort of idea that a lot of American pastors just don't believe. They believe, like you're saying, the leftists lie about some of these things where, as Christians, we check our faith at the door and we borrow from, biology or from philosophy or some other, very valid but less authoritative discipline in order to advance our agenda, where really as Christians we should be saying, no, Christ is Lord. Our nation needs to repent of legalized baby murder, and the pastors should really be leading the charge. And I think they are increasingly. I'm really encouraged to see a lot of pastors across the country leading the charges on abolition. A bunch of the folks I interviewed in the book are pastors. So I'm thinking of Brian Gunter in Louisiana, who's a stalwart for abolition. He's a Southern Baptist pastor. He started multiple pregnancy centers, was ministering outside abortion clinics when he was ever since he was in seminary. And Clay Hall's another great guy in Kentucky who is a champion for abolition in Kentucky, and just again another faithful pastor who is willing to speak aloud about these things and lead their people into righteousness. And I'm seeing it more and more across the country from pastors, and whether or not they call themselves abolitionists or whatever the case may be, they're vocal about supporting those in their churches that are trying to start life ministries or are going down to the abortion mills on Saturdays, or they're less and less shy about actually commending those efforts, because I think we're all recognized as American Christians that we're in a pretty late hour in our culture. The culture is going to hell in a handbasket, and it's done. We're done with just being nice to a fault, so to speak. And the 11th commandment, "Thou shalt be nice," and no longer speaking on things that could offend people, because we're provoking God's judgment on our nation, and we need to call our nation to repentance for it.
Yeah, absolutely. There was an interesting statistic that I saw recently. I think it was Pew Research put out just the differences in political parties between genders across different generations. And for Gen Z, our generation, the difference is crazy. It's like 58% of men are Republican and like 52% of women are Democrat. And that is obviously problematic for a million reasons. You already have people not getting married in the millennial generation and not having babies in the millennial generation. And in Gen Z, it's like, how could you find a wife if you're a guy who agrees with your values and is going to have children with you if they're so bought into the progressive ideology? Have you now? One thing that I wondered about this is because nowadays Republican can mean like 50 million different things, right? So,
Right, yeah.
Like, does that mean libertarian or what? Like, what does it actually mean? And have you found that younger Republican men, and I don't know if you've even looked into this, so you can tell me, younger Republican men tend to be more pro-life, or are they just sort of in the Republican side of things because they don't like the transgenderism thing? Or have you found there to be any sort of consistent pro-life, anti-abortion movement within the younger generations?
Certainly, yeah. And you probably have seen this too, but I think those in our generation are much more likely to say, just cut it all down, right? So we've reaped the worst of the sexual revolution. Our parents are the most likely to be divorced. We're the most likely to be, in pornography. I often tell older Christians, I don't know a single young man in my generation that hasn't at some point struggled with or have had to overcome pornography.
Absolutely.
Which is shocking, but I think that's empirically true.
It's like 55% of pastors, I think, are addicted to porn.
Wow.
As of like 10 years ago. So yeah, our generation is like, I think the average age of a first time viewer of porn in our generation is 6 years old, which is psychotic. Wow. So anyways, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So those who've been unplugged from the matrix, been woken up on those issues are, as we're seeing, looking to Christianity, looking to Western tradition, for actually something that's grounded and rooted that can address the wickedness of our age that they've unfortunately, borne the brunt of a lot of the time. So that's why, you're seeing young people enthusiastic about abolition, about, all sorts of matters that would be, I guess, not germane to older Christians, even those of good faith, because we're just so sick of the degeneracy, frankly. Yeah. And we want to turn back the clock into a more sane time, but also, of course, move forward into the future, but not have a civilization that can't sustain itself, that has things like 1.6 child per woman birth rates and things that guarantee that we can't actually have a future, right? We're the ones who have to actually live, for another 60 or 70 years under the conditions that are currently still devolving, still degenerating. So I'm seeing that a lot of among young people, and I think that's an encouraging sign. Honestly, it just has to be rooted in a sincere faith in Christ.
So one thing that I've been interested in recently is just why it's so difficult to get older generations to recognize the fundamental shift in worldview among young people. Because one of the things that you mentioned is that though there's some positive movement in the younger generations, you also have women who are like proud of how many abortions they've had. Like things have gotten to a level of evil and sinfulness. You're sort of, how I describe it, just you're like at the end of Romans 1, where it's like you start to be inventors of evil, and you start to approve of other people's evil. And I've noticed that older generations, Gen X, boomers, they don't get that. They don't get that we're inventors, that these younger generations are truly a different breed of evil than even the older generations, partly because of technological advancements. A lot of it because of technological advances, but also just because of generational sin and the regression in societies. When you teach them whatever it is, evolution, we teach people that they're a monkey, they start to act like monkeys. It's the sort of basic things. What has your experience been trying to explain to older people? Like, things are getting really, really bad. Can you, what do you say to them?
Yeah, I'll try to mention things like the pornography stat anecdotal stat I mentioned, where pretty much our entire generation is just awash in these things, and what does it actually do to a cohort of people over time? It completely ruins your life, basically, if you're involved in that with any level. Like you're saying, exposure as young as 6 years old, that has a sincere impact on your innocence and affects the kind of adult you'll become. So I think it's it's hard to get older folks to grasp it. And I think it's, part of it is just because, it's hard to grasp in general that these are such big problems, and, they just come from a very different age and world where these weren't issues. And, to their credit, a lot of them are recognizing that problem. And, I'm thinking of Tom Askell. So the president of Founders Ministries who published my book is an abolitionist, and he's, fully willing to, learn, some of these changing worldviews and why young people are drawn toward things like Christian nationalism and have discussions about those ideas instead of just, denouncing them or smugly saying that you don't know what you're talking about, son, go sit back down. So there are older folks who are willing to actually ask and answer those questions. And, but I think, broadly speaking, it's helpful for older folks not to just dismiss them out of hand and say, no, I'm going to cling to the old pietisms I learned, 30 years ago, but actually ask why the young generation is feeling the ways they're currently feeling and reacting the ways they are.
Yeah, it's interesting because the abolitionist position is something that's just like, if you bring it up to liberals, they obviously freak out. They think that you just want to they re-implement the patriarchy or whatever they want to call it. I guess I kind of do want to re-implement the patriarchy personally, because I think it's in accordance with God's law and in accordance with nature. But the younger generations seem to be completely shut off to this, and there seems to be this level of depravity that I know because I was in it. I feel like I was a part of it as a young person before I fully gave my life to Christ. And it seems like this level of evil, whatever is happening in these younger generations, like we said, is very hard for older people to see. And it's been frustrating for me just in a liberal area. I don't know exactly where you're from. Where do you live?
Outside Philly. So it's still fairly liberal.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, and one of the books that I'm reading right now is actually from the Founders publishers. It's In the Midst of the Years. I don't know if you've heard of that one. It just came out through their publisher. Tom Nettles wrote it, and it's about the history of revival in America. And it sort of starts with Jonathan Edwards, and it goes through all these different revivalist movements and different revivalists, and analyzes whether or not there was actual real fruit that comes from these revivals. First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, these sorts of things. And the sort of underlying theme of the book is the only revivals that have had actual impact and have lasted through generations were the ones that were predicated on the idea that human beings were completely and totally depraved. So the Calvinist, if you want to get like cringy with it, the tulip idea, the total depravity, that sort of thing, that had to be first. You're a sinner. You deserve to go to hell. You're dead in your trespasses. You can't live outside of Christ. And so that, like, as I'm reading that book and as I'm reading your book, I'm sort of thinking, it's obviously devastating that we live in a society that we live in, because it's 3,000 babies are being murdered every day and terrible things are happening all the time. On the other hand, you get to a certain level with people where they're so dead and they know that they're dead, and the younger generations are so completely lost and nihilistic, and they just have no meaning in life, that it almost feels like it's like ripe for the pickings, where we can preach the gospel and maybe something will actually happen. Have you noticed that? I guess my first question, have you noticed that same thing, that younger people might actually be ready to just hear the gospel plainly?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think our generation values authenticity. So when you are looking at a Christian pastor, you know he actually believes what he's saying. That has a huge impact on them. And so I'm thinking of, I think Doug Wilson said that on Tucker Carlson's show like a year ago. Like, I actually mean it is what he said. Yeah. Where a lot of the big Eva types, they're not sincere, right? They're sort of dancing around what they think may or may not be offensive. That immediately switches off our generation. We can see right through that. But yeah, I mean, and also Luke 16, right, with the parable of the prodigal son. He came to his senses when he was in the pigsty, thinking about how badly he wanted to eat the pig food. And that's, I think, a lot of young people is we're just completely lost and we don't know where else to go. So we go back to the Father's house, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. He's in the pigsty. He's definitely at the worst position in his life. So what's your, I guess, looking forward into the future? You have the abolitionist movement, but that's part of a broader. I hope it's part of a broader movement of we're going to like move past the whole millennialized Christianity thing where we never talk about anything and we're just postmodernists and we redefine every word and we pretend that the gospel is Jesus is your friend or your therapist, and we're going to hopefully move into Jesus Christ is the Lord and Savior of your life, and he's the Messiah, and he came and he died and he rose for your sins, and you're dead in your trespasses and you need to be born again. I hope that that's where we're moving. Do you think that sort of the abolitionist movement is intrinsically tied to that? And do you think that is actually where the future is going? Or do you think, or right now is it sort of like it could either go in that direction or we could like get nuked tomorrow as judgment upon us from God? Like, what do you think?
I certainly see the church waking up and repenting. Sure. and realizing that abortion apathy is wrong, right? In Leviticus 20, God talks about Moloch sacrifice, and he says, he sets his face against those who sacrifice their children to Moloch, but he also sets his face against those who turn a blind eye to it, right? So he's addressing Israel being tempted toward that sin. True. So he expects, it doesn't matter who's in your land, they're not allowed to do that. And if you just keep letting it happen, I'm going to set my face against you too, right? So it's rather terrifying. And I think more and more Christians in this country are realizing they can't just sit by and do nothing as this continues to happen, right? Abortion rates are still rising after Roe. It's up to, I think, 1.14 million abortions in 2024, which is getting back to like the 80s and 90s and those sorts of levels. So levels we haven't seen in quite a while. And I think there's more Christians realizing that it's not sufficient to just, continue regulating it to death and do your heartbeat bills and your proper burial bills and things that don't actually address the root of the issue, which is the fact that it's murder, that God judges nations that murder their children in this sort of way. So I'm starting to see the first roots of that. And I think I obviously can't speak for God, but, I hope and pray that he's seeing that and giving us time, right? And sending his Holy Spirit and awakening the church to actually do something about this.
Yeah, I would hope that the theologians would become awakened. I mean, I interview a lot of theologians. I read a lot of theology, and even in the Reformed, even in the Calvinist realms. And what I've noticed, because I'm a Calvinist and Reformed, but what I've noticed is that theologians want to talk about everything that has nothing to do with what's happening today. So we'll do retrieval projects. You get the Gavin Ortlands of the world that are, we're going to do a retrieval. And Gavin Ortland, he's got his own issues, but they'll do these theological issues, but none of them, I haven't seen a theological book written on the like biblical stance on murdering babies. I haven't seen that. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but from a theologian saying, hey, I'm going to look through the entire Bible. I'm going to see what the Bible has to say about murdering babies, and I'm going to write a theological book on this. I haven't seen that, and it feels like the theologians, and you mentioned Big Eva, and a lot of these huge pastors and mega church people, and even smaller churches and denominations have sort of, like you said, turn a blind eye to this whole abortion thing. Have you noticed that theologians and Christian thinkers have just sort of decided, hey, we're not even going to touch this issue of abortion. We're just going to keep writing books on like, what is the Trinity or things like that? I don't know. Maybe I'm just seeing that, but are you seeing that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can think of a few books that do try to address the sorts of issues, but it's not from the biggest publishers, the most important seminaries. It's pastors who, are maybe on the fringe, have a small church, but they want to sincerely address the issue. Yes. I want to be charitable and say, of course, the theologian is called toward, thinking about those questions of what is the Trinity and communicating it to God's people and studying it and training the next generation of pastors for those sorts of bread and butter doctrines. But it's absolutely right. Like the Bible is not silent on, how to treat national sin, how to deal with child sacrifice, and Christian history isn't either. If you actually, I remember going through one book by George Grant, third time around, and he has an entire chapter just packed with quotes from early church fathers up through the Reformation of how they were talking about abortion. They were saying that, treat it like murder, apply the same penalties you would in their letters and things like that, apply the same penalties that you would for somebody who murdered their born baby. For women who take abortion drugs, they're committing self-mutilation. So they have no problem rejecting the second victim narrative. You just see this very consistent tone throughout all of Christian history that we haven't had in other issues, right? Baptism, the Lord's Supper, the papacy, all these various controversies. There was heated debate about them, but with child sacrifice, with abortion, it's been pretty unanimous. When the Christians go into a new culture, they build schools and hospitals, they overturn infanticide and abortion, infant exposure, and we can't get those basic things right as American Christians, even with all of our heritage, our very rich heritage as Western Christians. We still can't get that very basic question right, which is really honestly, disappointing. And, I hope that this repentance that I think we're starting to see just sweeps through the seminaries too, and that seminaries sort of grow a spine on this issue.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I've read the church fathers discussed the abortion. They also discussed immodesty and things like that. And when you read them and you're like, holy crap, these guys are like super intense, which is obviously they're just taking what you read in scripture and applying it pretty basically. I mean, I don't think that any of them go too far. I think there are particular little theological things here and there that I think the fathers get wrong. But anyways, it is all over church history that abortion is murder. And you don't hear anybody talk about that. I don't hear anybody talk about that. So yeah, I guess we only talked about one of the states in this book. You talked about Oklahoma, because that seems to be, like you said, kind of the big one. I did the next chapter on Arizona. I thought was actually kind of interesting because I didn't know about and I'm forgetting his name as we speak, the baseball player who became a Christian and then basically is leading the charge in Arizona. Can you kind of break that story down a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. So Dennis Sarfate. So he was a pretty accomplished Major League Baseball pitcher. And when he was retiring or moving toward retirement, he became a Christian, had been sort of a nominal Catholic most of his life. And but his wife was conceived in a one-night stand in a truck stop, basically. Yeah. And she was adopted by her parents, and she led those parents to the Lord. She led him to the Lord eventually. So he looks at his wife, and his life wouldn't have been the same without her, not even remotely close. And he realizes that if her mom had gone through what so many other women choose to do with just murdering the baby, none of that would have happened. So that's what sort of convicted him. And but again, in Arizona, it was Kathy Herod from Center for Arizona Policy, a major pro-life group that stood in their way and tried to kill the bill in their states. So it's the same pattern of, unfortunately, Christians being raised up and doing the right thing. God really moving in their hearts and their lives to oppose baby murder, and then it's these established pro-life groups who come after them first.
Yeah, man, that's just, it's just like horrible to hear. One of the things that I've been noticing, and I don't know if you're noticing this, so I'm getting a gauge on whether or not I'm just insane here, or if other people are noticing these things, is that the millennial generation seems to be, so shifting into these positions of authority, whether that be in government, whether it be in big churches across the country, whether that be in Christian organizations. And I've noticed that once these millennials become CEOs or start to run the organization, I can think of one in particular, which is Crossway, which I thought was a phenomenal publisher for a long time. And I've actually interviewed a lot of their authors and even people in their higher ups. But in the last year or two, they got a new CEO who was this millennial dude, and a lot of their books now seem to be leaning a little bit left and just kind of going down that weird sort of gospel coalition Christianity today equivocating sort of nonsense, and getting more people of color writing books and things like that. Stuff that's why are we doing that? And they were really solid. And I'm even, I think this will happen with Desiring God. I think it has already started happening with Desiring God. Have you noticed that the millennial generation seems to be dead set on just destroying institutions and setting them on fire, Christian institutions, and turning them into sort of these postmodern havens? Let's start with that question and then we'll move forward. But have you noticed that, or is it just me?
I think so. And it's not all millennials, but there's definitely the trend to that respect, where a lot of them were sort of waiting for the boomers or the Gen X to retire, and they're slipping into those spots, and they're just continuing that really bad legacy. So you have to sort of make a choice as a younger man. Do I wait my turn in an established institution and eventually take it over in a few decades, or do I start something new entirely, go out into the wilderness? And those who have chosen the former course, it's not always bad to do that, but I think that temptation certainly exists to shore up, show that you're going to just shore up the legacy of, the older man who's retiring and leaving it all to you. And that's not always a good thing.
Yeah. What do we do about that? Because they are in charge of some of the biggest institutions, Christian institutions in the country, young Gen Zers are not necessarily like, I don't see a really strong group of leaders in the Gen Z generation. There's some that are like solid, but nobody that's sort of gunning for positions of authority, mostly because Gen Zers are like nihilistic and they just hate their life. And even if they're Christians, they're totally confused and they don't know what the heck is going on. And so what do you do? Because it feels like this is an actual effort by the millennials to get into these churches, to basically take over their institutions, take over their leadership, and then turn them into these equivocating, postmodern, self-worshiping, I don't know, Jesus is your friend institutions. Like what do you do about that? Like I'm in Madison and this is happening to every single church and institution in the city. And if you speak up about it, if you say anything about it, they'll just belittle you. They'll publicly tell everybody that you're a liar. This has happened to me. Personally, if you just say, hey guys, I think like we shouldn't support groups that murder babies, they'll just trash you publicly and you can't really do anything about it. So like, I don't know, maybe I've experienced this more than you have. And cause I'm in Madison, it's like a terrible freak show here, but like, what would you do about that? Cause you've been in different institutions across, the conservative landscape, and people who claim to be Christians, they're all over the place and then they lie and they're obviously not Christians. Like, how do you actually fight that in a way that's constructive? It's a long question. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's sort of an age-old question of how do you stop an institution from trending left? Because that is the leftist playbook: is you infiltrate institutions, you do the long march through the institutions, and you turn them into left, sort of like viruses, right? They infiltrate a cell and they just make that cell into a virus factory. Absolutely. So you're pumping out new. So that's what's happening to a lot of, crossways and gospel coalitions is, the sickness gets in and it just spreads like gangrene, like scripture warns us, with egalitarianism, with just general softness, fear of man. It could be really any number of pathogens that we're tempted with today. But yeah, the question is, how do you actually retain a sense of orthodoxy and a commitment to not giving into those things? And I think it's a big part of it is who you have in leadership, the sort of men you put on your board of directors, in your executive suite. So it's beyond ministries, right? It's companies, it's government agencies, it's like we're saying ministries and churches, having men who are like, think of John MacArthur, right? Because he just passed away a few weeks ago. He did. Yeah. And the men who surrounded him at Grace Community when they went through COVID in 2020 and stood against the state. It's not a very common man who will actually, stand up to Gavin Newsom into the city of Los Angeles and just say, no, we're gonna show up to worship. We're just gonna ignore your regulations because they're null and void. Right. So you actually need to find those sorts of men, and that means us as Gen Z. The challenge for us is to become those sorts of men who don't flinch at adversity, who are fine with challenging the spirit of the age. And I think a lot of us have that bent toward us, and maybe to your point of us not really rising in established institutions, maybe that's part of the challenge is us figuring out how to actually do that without compromising our convictions in the process. Mm-hmm.
You might have to just start new things too. I mean, that might be the reality too. It might just be so compromised that you just have to start a new thing. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about this, because I've had a hard time trying to reconcile particular things in the sort of, let's just say, theologically conservative, more Calvinist Reformed world. One of these things is like John Piper. So John Piper, who, I'm Anglican, I'm J.I. Packer Anglican Calvinist. So I don't agree with all the Baptist ways of how they understand certain things, but John Piper in certain ways has been incredibly helpful for me in, reading his theology or just listening to him preach, especially in the realm of Calvinism, which I just think is biblical theology. And then you read something like what he wrote, I think right after Obama was elected, where he said that he was like crying because it was the most amazing thing to see a black president, and how he had to re-examine his whiteness and think like. And you think I don't know what to think when it comes to this. Like, is this person a Christian or is this person not a Christian? And people will be like, "What do you mean is John Piper a Christian?" What I'm trying to say is you can't separate politics and theology, right? So you're a comprehensive human being. We all have to think theologically, philosophically, economically, politically. Like, all of these things are comprehensive. They're all within the Word of God. We can find them in all different places, and we're supposed to best comprehensively understand our Christian worldview and then live that out. When you have somebody who's got such a bad bad take, like such a horrible take on politics. Voting for people like Obama who like actively want to see the slaughter of innocent human beings, not just in the womb, but outside of the womb. What do you make of that? What do you yourself make of? Like, what do you do about that?
Right. And we all have blind spots. That's part of it.
Right.
Certainly is, John Piper infamously had that article where he was saying, he would never really, defend his wife if somebody busted into their house and with a gun, he would just let that person kill them all. Essentially wouldn't exercise self-defense and rightly got some blowback from that. But I think it's just because he's a product of our age, right? Of pietism and not really thinking clearly about things like self-defense and, having this image of Jesus where he's merely meek and mild isn't, full of justice and holiness and righteousness and what that leads him to do and how we can rightly imitate him in those things. And, so I wouldn't say that he's not a Christian. I would just say he's in many ways a product of our age. And we certainly as Gen Z are going to realize as we get older that we have some of those errors too in our theology and in our practice.
I agree. Look, I don't disagree with the hit. Somebody comes into your house with a gun. I actually maybe I sound great. I actually think there's some legitimacy to a theological position that says that you don't kill that person. I don't exactly know where I stand there, but when it comes to like we're going to poison and decapitate children, I don't think that those are morally equivalent. And so when I think about, somebody breaking into your house, self-defense, that's a difficult theological conversation because in the Old Testament, the only way in which you were able to defend yourself was, I think, if somebody broke into your home in the middle of the night, and there's all these particular parameters around exactly when you could defend yourself in accordance with the Old Testament. And that's the only place that's talked about. And so I think that there could be some really good, well-meaning, theologically precise people who could say, look, I don't feel comfortable defending myself because I know my soul is saved and I'm going to heaven and I don't know where this person is going. On the other hand, there is, like we've been talking about this whole conversation, a million places in the Bible that says explicitly and implicitly, don't murder babies. And Jesus says, there are two things I think of. Whatever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. And he also says, anybody who leads a child astray, it would be better if somebody were to tie a millstone around your neck and throw you into the lake. And so my take is if you're voting for people who are going to murder children, I think you've got yourself into incredibly ambiguous, very difficult to discern area of are you saved or not? Like, how can you figure that out?
Right.
I know I'm not trying to push back for just to be rude, but I'm honestly trying to figure this out because there's so many pastors who just seem to be like accurate theologically and then blind politically. And I have no clue what that means. What is that saying of them? So I don't know if you have any comments on that. If you do, I'd love to hear them.
No, you're not wrong. Yeah, I certainly see that where I think part of it is like the moral panics that we have as a culture. So I'm thinking of 2020 in that context where, we forget how radically the left-wing ideas about race just swept through the church and took with it really sound institutions like Gospel Coalition was, it had signs of that sort of thing a few years earlier of the critical theory. They had their MLK 50 event and things like that. But, it really just swept through the evangelical church in a lot of ways. And, that's a product in many cases of media manipulation of politics, just that being shoved down our throats and us having to make statements about it. And, the crazy things that were happening. So, part of it is, you can give into the emotional sabotage of that. So maybe it's just part of it is just having a backbone and, not giving into those trends and saying, I don't care what you tell me. I'm not going to vote for a baby murdering Democrat for president. I'm just not going to do it. Now, whether or not you vote for a baby murder Republican as a result of that is a different question. I didn't vote for either of them in 2024. But
you didn't vote for, obviously not Kamala.
Right.
You didn't vote for Trump. Is that what you're saying?
No, I didn't. Yeah. Cause I didn't want to reward him, gutting the RNC platform and some of those other things.
Robert George has that position. Robert P. George, do you know him?
Yeah. Yes.
From Princeton. I interviewed him and I said, who'd you vote for? And he's like, I didn't vote for either of them because I'm not going to vote for somebody who same answer that you just gave. Right. I think that's interesting. So like, what do you say about what Michael Knowles, his sort of thing on this? Obviously he's a Catholic and the Catholics, they've got some issues, but like I think he takes a little bit too pragmatic or utilitarian of a position on particular things, but man, like I listened to him and he's got sound logic. He is so hardcore MAGA, so big on Trump. And I did vote for Trump. And I thought for the first time, 2020 had all that BS about the lesser of two evils. I don't think that was, or sorry, 2020 and 2016, they would say the lesser of two evils. That wasn't the case. Trump was pro-life. He went to the March for Life. He was going to overturn Roe. It wasn't the lesser of two evils. Trump was genuinely, I think, genuinely and generally conservative politician. In 2024, I do think we are in a position of the lesser of two evils. And in that case, I took the lesser of two evils. Whatever. I could have been wrong. Like, what do you make of the MAGA argument, though? Are you sort of just like, no, screw the whole MAGA thing? That's just like convoluting everything, and we're going in the wrong direction. Is that generally what you think?
Yeah, I think it's a basic principle of politics that you don't reward people who betray you. So I saw that as betrayal in late 2022. Late 2023, early 2024, when that trade was made, like we were talking about earlier, with not caring what the pro-life base has to say and trying to go for the moderate voters instead. I think if I tried to warn about this last year, if the Republicans, if conservative evangelicals just vote for Trump anyway, that just teaches every Republican in the country you get to betray our priorities and get away with it. It doesn't really matter. We're just going to vote for whoever has an R next to their name. And Republicans for decades have made fun of urban African Americans who vote 90% Democrat no matter what, even though the Democrats haven't fixed the inner cities and things of that nature. But we really do the same thing with Republicans a lot of the time, where it's very rare that our interests are actually advanced in this country. And Trump may be an outlier on some issues, or on immigration, on government reform, some of these things. But we're way too tolerant of people who just betray us, and we don't expect them to actually win our vote and actually seek our vote and promise and then fulfill big things. So that was sort of my calculation with whether or not to vote for Trump. I voted for some Republicans down ballot. I didn't vote for others, depending on how hard they compromise on that issue. But again, you don't get to reward those who betray you and then expect nothing bad to happen as a result.
So what would you have done? My thought process was like, basically, if Kamala gets into office, I don't know what's going to happen. She's going to try to negotiate with Putin. Maybe not. Who knows who she's going to become? The whole geopolitical world is going to fall apart. She's probably going to try to do whatever she can to re-implement Roe, if she can, which I don't know if she would have been able to, but probably not. But she would have done whatever she can to make abortion as legal as she possibly could and take as many loopholes as she could. It is like, and this isn't just like a personal question. I voted for who I'm fine. I don't feel insecure about myself. But is there an argument, do you think, that's actually sound for voting for Trump, especially in this last election when it felt like everything was on the line a little bit? And maybe that's just the moment. Maybe everybody's just a sensationalist and we're all just governed by our emotions, which is totally legitimate. We might be. But is there an argument that you would think, oh, that's a good argument for voting for somebody like Trump? Or is it sort of like he just betrayed us, so we don't want him?
No, certainly. I think the best argument that I heard last year was, 1 Timothy 2, you want kings and rulers in high places who kind of leave the church alone and let us do our things, let us live quiet and peaceful lives. So I think without a doubt, Trump would have done that more than Kamala. We had the Biden administration weaponizing the Department of Justice against Christians, against pro-lifers, pro-life grandmas outside of abortion clinics, peacefully protesting. So I think that was the best argument for voting for Trump. It was pretty persuasive, honestly. But again, on balance, I still voted against him. And, I just didn't feel good about rewarding baby murder with my votes. I don't necessarily need somebody to be a perfect abolitionist, 5-point abolitionist in order to vote for them. But I also expect them to actually sincerely want to end abortion in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Well, when I had interviewed Robert George, I don't know how long ago this was, we had discussed a little bit about what sort of arguments can you make against pro-abortionist, pro-baby murdering people. And again, he's an older guy, professor, Princeton, whatever. He is wanting to make all of these. What I picked up was that a lot of these sort of natural law, rationalistic sort of scientific arguments for this is a human being and kind of catching people in their inconsistent logic or the fallacies that they're engaging in. And while I think that that's all good and dandy and like you should catch people in their logical fallacies and call them on that, I was trying to make the point to him that I don't think younger people care at all. Like I've talked to younger people and they've said, actually a lot of them, people our age have just been like, I know it's a baby. I know it's a human. I want to kill it. And
right.
What's the one-on-one conversation? You're talking to some woman who's about to go into Planned Parenthood. She's going to murder her child. And like, what's your message to her? What are you saying to her? Are you going to try to argue it out scientifically with her?
No, of course not. Yeah. So I've been outside of Planned Parenthood for 6 years on most Saturdays. And, I've seen thousands of women go through with murdering their baby, and not one of them has not known it was a baby. They're all, that's not the issue at all. It's a hard issue. And the most success we've gotten is when we preached the gospel and just said,
Good.
God has sent his son to die for sinners and to redeem them. And that same son is going to judge the world in righteousness. And you'll have to stand before him one day and give an account for what you're going to do this morning. Right. That's how urgent this is. That's how important this is. And we don't want that for you. So if you're tempted toward this because of, finances or medical, we'll help you with that. But please do not kill your baby. That's the sort of thing that we've seen actually sway people the most. It's not just, let me talk to you about fetal development stages for 30 minutes. Yeah. It's not, they recognize, even if they haven't taken high school biology, they're going to know that it's a baby, that it's a person. If they wait 9 months, they're going to be able to hold him or her in their arms. It's not a mystery as to what it actually is. When they say, it's just a clump of cells or it doesn't even have a heartbeat yet, they're just repeating back the lies they've heard that they're using to cover up the truth. Like you said, Romans 1, they're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. That's all it boils down to. So all those euphemisms, all those arguments that we may be tempted to actually try to refute, we can do that, of course, but at the end of the day, we have to just call it out for what it is and say, you don't actually believe that it's just a clump of cells, because we're all clumps of cells, right? It's a person, and you're just looking for a valid reason to be able to murder it under cover of law, because that's what's most convenient for you. And the more we say that, the more we call the bluff and we make the issue about Christ and his authority and, human sin. The more we can get to those sorts of issues, the better.
Wait, okay. So look, my millennial pastor who wears skinny jeans and has the inflection of a 3.5-year-old would say that that's just cramming ideology down somebody's, it's just cramming your religion down somebody's throat, and that's never, ever going to work. I've heard this. I've literally heard this at mega churches, not even mega churches, just any church really in the non-denominational kind of sphere. That's what they'll tell you. If you said that to somebody here in Madison, you said, hey, I just go to Planned Parenthood Saturdays and I talk to these women. I'd say, look, you're committing a sin. God's going to judge you for the sin. You need to repent and we'll help you out. And that's been the most effective. They'd be like, no, you're just cramming your Christian religion down people's throats. This is what pastors will say. And you're just saying, no, it actually just works better than any other. Have you tried any other method, or is that sort of just what you've done? Just straight up gospel presentation?
Yeah, pretty much the whole time we've been down there, just because the people who took me down there first, 6 years ago, were the same way. So I learned from them. And of course, speaking truth in love. So we're not just screaming at people or anything like that, but we're just being sincere, offering help, offering resources, saying that we care for you, but at the same time, not shrinking back from, this is murder. God judges this eternally. And we're calling you to repent and trust in Christ rather than go through with this. So I haven't tried in any other way. I know of other folks down there who do try it in a little bit, softer of ways, or and it doesn't really work out for them. They're not taken seriously, because I think even the women going in kind of recognize, like, you don't really know why I'm here. It doesn't really break through that hardness of heart very well, but really the word of God alone has the power to do that.
So have you personally had any difficulties? Have people come after you basically for one? Has this book come out officially? I know that I have the PDF version of it, but has it actually come out? As
of this week, yeah. So early August. It should be shipping now. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So I guess you're going to get more and more feedback as time goes on. As you've reported on this and in writing this book, have you had difficulty sort of maybe even being ostracized from particular conservative groups, media outlets, whatever it is, for just being very blunt and straightforward about what the issue is and what you want to see happen with the abolitionist movement?
Yeah, for sure. So my current role as communications director of Foundation to Abolish Abortion, my whole job is talking to reporters and trying to get them to cover some of our bills, to talk about the debate between abolition and pro-life. And a lot of it is, for so long, it was just the pro-life groups that had their ears, right? So whenever Roe was overturned or whenever a certain bill passed in a given state, it was those groups who were offering the comments to the media first and discipling, that those institutions, those classes of people who bring the news to the public. So there's been a lot of hesitance, and in not all cases. We've had some pretty good success actually these past few months in getting big conservative outlets to cover our stuff. But there's still a lot of inertia with the pro-life groups, and not really seeing immediate abolition as feasible, and therefore not being interested in covering it. So we're trying to overcome that and change the conversation. But even the fact that we're walking around their heads a little bit with some of our arguments and diagnoses after Roe was overturned 3 years later, and again, abortions are rising, abortions are higher than before. We're starting to have an effect.
Are there any conservative news / media outlets? You obviously work for the Daily Wire. You don't work for them anymore. That you would say, is very explicitly Christian, very explicitly abolitionist focused and prominent in the conservative news and media realm? That I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm wondering, you probably are more in that world.
Sure. I can't think of any that are explicitly abolitionists. I know several reporters who are friendly toward it and are willing to cover it. Leah Savas at World, who I think wrote that book you were mentioning earlier about the street level history of abortion. She's covered the equal protection bills. I don't know where she actually stands on it, but she's been very fair in covering those issues. So I write a little bit on the side for the Western Journal. So those editors there are very friendly toward abolition. They see why it's important. They let me write op-eds pretty frequently about that topic. So they're definitely out there. I can't think of any one, news outlet that is like explicitly abolitionist in nature, but I think a lot of individual reporters, newsrooms are seeing why it's an important discussion and are willing to have it. And
I've had Leah on the podcast twice, and I think she gives a fair breakdown of the issue. I don't actually know exactly where she stands on it. As part of the abolitionist movement, I don't think I read anything in the book about this. Are you also I assume you're abolishing IVF?
Yeah, certainly. So a lot of these bills that apply to, just extending the same protections that exist for born people to preborn people, they would just exclude practices that are used in IVF. So selective discarding, tossing conceived babies in the trash, things like that would not be allowable under our bills. Yeah.
Good. That's great. I mean, that's what I like to hear. Yeah. I've as living in a very progressive place, I've sort of felt like in my life, I've gone through all of the steps of trying all the different ways to convince people that abortion is wrong. And really, like you're saying, the only effective method is just preaching the gospel to people and being very straightforward about it, trying to be mealy mouthed or trying to play their postmodern game and use the language that they want you to use. It just sort of gives them ground. It just helps reinforce their ideologies and their presuppositions in a way that's not helpful. It seems to me like the best way to have these conversations is breaking through with the words of Scripture and just saying, this is exactly what I think, take it or leave it. Kind of like Jesus did, kind of like everybody in the New Testament did. And in the Old Testament, they're just very straightforward about, this is what God says, and I believe this, and I'm going to do it this way. And I think that you should follow. Ben, this is it. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for writing this book. I think this is a very important book, and I think it's part of a broader movement of journalists, and really only journalists, not really anybody in the theological or biblical realm, as much as journalists going out and being like, wait a second, there seems to be a bunch of corruption, a bunch of weird things that has happened in the Republican Party and in the church and in the evangelical world over the past 50 years, 60 years. And we need to uncover some of this stuff because there's a lot of money, there's a lot of power, corruption, whatever it is, it's all there. And it almost feels like with Basham's book on Shepherds for Sale and with your book, I feel like we're scratching the surface, like barely scratching the surface of what has actually been going on for 60 years in the evangelical church to get to the point in which a huge portion of evangelicals across the country will pretend that they don't see the issue with abortion, will pretend that there's no problem with transgenderism, will pretend that there's no problem with homosexuality. Like there are objective, blatant things in the Bible, very clear verses in the Bible that say these things are sin, these things are evil. And And a huge portion of the church just doesn't agree with that. They just don't agree with the Bible. And so we need more of what you're doing is, I mean, you just finished this book. I don't want to like ask you like, what are you going to do next? But what are you going to do next? I guess like, is this going to be continued research for you?
Yeah, I'll certainly continue to work to expose some of these things in the pro-life world. So like I said, I work full-time for a foundation to abolish abortion. So that's my full-time job now, is helping to expose some of these things and advance abolition bills. I do have another book project in the works that is not completely about abortion, but is in the vein of a lot of things we're talking about, that I just broke ground on last week. So I'm excited for that to come out hopefully in about a year, maybe, but sort of addressing some of these political pietisms that we face in the evangelical world that really slow us down in terms of, advancing righteousness in the public square. So yeah, certainly, I want to use the skills that God gave me for writing and those sorts of things to make an impact for righteousness.
Absolutely. That's great. Ben, thanks for doing this podcast. Thanks for writing this book. I really appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.